Have you ever wondered what betrayal tastes like when it comes from someone who once swore to die beside you? Picture this: Port Royal in flames, a sky full of ash, and Blackbeard, yes, the terror of the seas, clutching a letter soaked in blood. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration from Sebastián Valera, the man he once called brother. A fellow pirate who broke their sacred oath and sold his loyalty to the French crown. This isn't one of those polished pirate stories where heroes wear clean hats and sail into the sunset. This is a confession, a wound reopened, a tale of revenge, guilt, and a curse that began the moment trust was shattered. Legends aren't just told, they're passed from sailor to sailor. If you crave the untold tales of the sea, loyalty, loss, and vengeance, subscribe to the channel and claim your place in our crew. I remember the night the killer stepped out from the shadows, not with noise, not with rage, but with silence, colder than the wind that rolls. Through the Barlovento reefs after dusk, they called him the Hawk, not a name earned by chance. No one knew his true birth name or what twisted path led him to the craft of silent endings. But the taverns whispered of his hand, steady with a blade, faster than thunder with a blunderbuss, and his eyes, empty as if something had already taken him from this world long ago. He came from the Windward Islands, that much I know. They say he was raised among storms and shipwrecks, where death taught him how to walk before he learned to speak. His loyalty belonged to no flag, no coin, no man, only the contract. And when Sebastián Valera wanted Blackbeard gone, not just gone, but erased from every sailor's memory, it was the Hawk he summoned. It happened in Saint-Domingue. I was there. The moon hung like a broken tooth in the sky, the air thick with rum, sweat, and secrets. In the far corner of the tavern, he sat alone, cloaked in darkness, boots never making a sound against the wooden floor. Valera's messenger approached him. No name spoken, just a satchel slid across the table and a quiet nod toward the east, toward the sea, toward Blackbeard. The job was simple. Follow the devil of the Caribbean. Watch, wait. And when the time came, make sure his story ended in silence. No glory, no blaze of cannon fire, just the cold edge of finality. But here's the part most never heard. The Hawk didn't move fast. He studied. He sailed from port to port, staying in the dark like a shadow, looking for its shape. He followed whispers, traced wreckage, listened for the wake of Blackbeard's fury across the Antilles. He wasn't just hunting a man, he was watching a legend, and that changes a killer. I remember his words once, spoken through cracked lips in a port alley after too much rum. He's not like the others. When you look into Blackbeard's eyes, you feel like he already knew you were coming. Some say the Hawk vanished before the job was done. Others claim he still walks among the mangroves of Tortuga, eyes sharp, waiting for a ghost that never left the sea. But I remember the storm that followed. I remember the look on Valera's face when the shadows started watching him. There are pirate stories meant to entertain. This one leaves scars. They called him the boy with the bronze staff, though few ever knew why. But I remember the night he vanished into the marshes, nothing but a satchel on his back and fury in his eyes. His name was Mateo Reyes, no older than 16, lean as a rope, with fire in his blood and salt in his soul. Born below the deck of a forgotten merchant ship and raised in the back alleys of Tortuga, Mateo had seen things no child should. But there was one man he trusted more than life itself: Blackbeard. Years ago, it was Blackbeard who had pulled his mother from the hands of men who meant to sell her to the highest bidder. No payment, no glory. Just one slash of the cutlass, and a warning that still echoed in the docks, not while I breathe. From that day forward, Mateo's heart belonged to him. He was only a cabin boy then, scrubbing decks, patching sails, listening more than he spoke. But that night, that cursed night, he heard something he wasn't meant to hear. Hidden behind barrels of salt and spice in a Saint-Domingue warehouse, Mateo caught the whispers of betrayal, names, coins, a plan soaked in venom. They were coming for Blackbeard, and they weren't coming alone. He didn't wait. He didn't speak. No time for orders or counsel. Mateo stole a horse before the moon was high, left behind the tavern lights, and rode west into the heart of darkness, where mangroves swallowed the stars and marshes spoke in silence. He crossed lands no sailor dared walk on foot, swamps that breathed like beasts and reefs sharp as broken teeth. Each step burned, each hour weighed heavier than the last. But he didn't stop. Not for the storm, not for the wolves, not for the fear that clawed at the back of his throat, because loyalty is strange like that. It doesn't need permission, it just burns. Some say he made it, that he reached the cliffs near Havana just before dawn, clothes torn, hands bleeding, eyes wide with warning. Others say the boy disappeared in the mangroves, swallowed by the very path he chose. But I still remember the staff, bronze, carved with his mother's name, left at the edge of the trail as if to say, I was here, I tried, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. There are winds that carry hope, and winds that carry warnings. But that night, there was no wind at all, just a silence thick enough to choke a man. Blackbeard sat hunched beside the battered hull of the Queen's Revenge, hands wrapped around a whetstone, slowly dragging it along the edge of his curved blade. Sparks danced, but his eyes didn't move from the horizon. His crew worked in silence around him, patching planks, mending sails, yet the air itself felt wrong. The wind's gone quiet, he muttered, not to anyone in particular. That's never a good sign. Then came the sound of footsteps, fast, uneven, half staggered, half determined, and from between the shadows of the palms, a shape emerged, drenched in sweat, sea salt, and fear. Mateo. His chest heaved, his clothes were torn, soaked from the swamps, and blood clung to the corner of his mouth, but his eyes held something no storm could wash away. They're coming, he said, voice trembling. They paid for it with cursed gold. Blackbeard didn't move, not at first, just the soft rasp of steel being sharpened and the quiet crackle of fire nearby. Then his gaze locked with the boys, heavy and unblinking. They want to drown your name, Captain, Mateo whispered. Not kill you, bury you, make you vanish like mist, as if you were never here. For a long moment, the jungle seemed to stop breathing. The only sound was the distant creak of the ship and the quiet beat of drums far out at sea, or maybe just the heartbeat in Mateo's ears. Blackbeard stood, not with fear, not with rage, but with that stillness he carried like a second skin, the kind that made grown men turn away when his shadow passed. He looked toward the dark water, blade in hand, and said only this, "Let them come." And in that moment the air shifted, not with peace, but with promise, the kind that sinks deep into bone, the kind you don't forget, because some winds don't carry comfort, some winds carry war. Time no longer moved like it should. Each second felt like a warning whispered by the sea itself. Blackbeard stood beneath the torchlight, shadows dancing across his face like old ghosts. The boy's warning had torn away the last veil of calm. Now, only action remained. No speeches, no fear, only decisions that would leave scars. "We split," he said, voice low but sharp. 3 paths, 1 fate. He would lead the first group himself, the sharpest blades, the ones who had followed him through storms and sieges. Men who didn't flinch when the cannons fell silent. Their task to be seen, to draw the eye, to look vulnerable. The second group he gave to Isabelle Leclerc, a corsair once sworn to the French crown, now married to the sea and no man else. She wore vengeance like perfume and walked with the grace of someone who had chosen exile over obedience. Isabel never bowed to anyone, except Blackbeard once, after he pulled her from the gallows in Guadeloupe. Since then, she'd followed him not out of duty, but because she believed in the chaos he carried. The third group was placed in the hands of Gaspar Mendoza, a former Spanish naval officer whose chest bore the burn marks of a shipwreck that should have taken his life. He owed that life to Blackbeard, and the debt still burned in his eyes like embers. Quiet, disciplined, and unforgiving, Gaspar never spoke more than needed. But when he did, men listened. Their destination, the jagged reefs near Tortuga, a maze of coral and death where ships went to. Rotten secrets were buried in barnacles. That's where the hawk believed he'd find Blackbeard asleep, unaware, exposed. But it was no place for sleep. It was a trap. They called it the Devil's Three Claws, a triangle of stone and salt where the tide moved wrong and the air stank of old curses. Blackbeard's plan was simple in theory, impossible in execution. Draw the killer into the center where all three claws could close at once. Trust the sea, he said, staring into the map drawn in blood and charcoal, but never let it think you trust it. No more words, no farewells, just the silent nods of those who knew that not everyone would return. The reef waited, and so did something else, something none of them had named. They moved like shadows, low to the ground, blades drawn, breath held tight in their chests. The hawk, silent as ever, crept toward the camp with a traitor at his side, a man named Joaquin the One-Eyed. Once, he'd served under Blackbeard himself, scrubbing the decks, of the Queen's revenge and cursing the crown with the rest of them. But greed has a voice louder than loyalty, and Joaquin had sold his soul and Blackbeard's secrets for a pouch of cursed gold. Now, he walked beside the silent killer, leading him to what was supposed to be the captain's final resting place. The camp came into view through the mangroves, quiet, still, and strangely untouched by wind or wave. A few glowing embers blinked beneath fake fire pits. Barrels were scattered like bones, and uniforms hung from branches like limp scarecrows. It looked abandoned, or worse, vulnerable. "This is it," Joaquin muttered, pointing toward the largest tent. "He sleeps there." But something wasn't right. The air smelled too clean, the sand too undisturbed. Still, the hawk didn't hesitate. His eyes locked on a dark silhouette seated near the tent. Broad-shouldered, familiar. A shadow shaped like a man who had ruled the Caribbean with fire. Without a word, he raised his pistol. One shot. The figure fell, and with it, so did Joaquin. The body that hit the ground wasn't Blackbeard, it was Joaquin himself, his chest split open by the very bullet meant for another. Dressed in the captain's coat, hair blackened with pitch, posed to draw fire, a decoy, a puppet in a play built from betrayal. The hawk stood over the corpse, expression unreadable. Around him, the false camp flickered and cracked, as if the lie itself had caught fire. He had been led into a stage, a performance, crafted by a man who had survived this long by thinking 3 steps ahead, and who had once said, "Let them believe they're the hunters." In the distance, a conch shell blew once, then twice, and from the trees the claws began to close. The hills stood silent, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. Then 3 gunshots split the sky. That was the signal, and with it, the sea unleashed its fury, not in waves, but in fire. From the cliffs above the reef, Isabelle Leclerc descended, like a storm wrapped in steel, her blade already drawn, her voice carried on the wind, not shouting, singing, like a lullaby meant for the dying. At her side, The crew she had handpicked, wild-eyed, loyal to the grave, surged forward with fury sharpened by silence. On the opposite flank, Gaspar Mendoza moved like a ghost in uniform. His team struck with brutal precision, each step calculated, each shot measured. He gave no orders. He didn't have to. The years of discipline clung to his every movement, and his eyes, always watching, never flinched, even as men fell screaming around him. The hawk never saw it coming. He was too deep in the trap. His pistol fired once, then jammed. Blood was already running from a wound near his ribs. He didn't know where it came from or when it had been delivered. Panic rippled through his crew as they realized the camp had been a cage. The mangroves offered no exit. The paths were sealed. In the smoke and screams, the hawk broke from the chaos and mounted his horse, kicking hard toward the northern slope. Behind him, one of his men fell to a blade, another to a trap line rigged with barbs. Still, he galloped through the burning underbrush, coughing, bleeding, until the shot came. One single shot, a clean one. Gaspar's marksmanship was infamous across 3 navies, and that night it found its final proof. The hawk's horse collapsed with a scream, crashing against the moss-covered rocks. The assassin was thrown hard against the soil, groaning, trying to stand, reaching for the dagger hidden in his boot. But Isabel was already there. Her boot crushed his wrist before he could draw it. He didn't fight, not after that. Some men recognize when the sea has chosen their fate. They bound him in chains, salvaged from an old wreck, cold iron soaked in rust and memory, and dragged him to the center of the reef. There, between the broken branches and the blood-soaked leaves, stood Blackbeard. No words were spoken. The hawk was tied to a gnarled tree, the roots half submerged in the tide. His eyes met Blackbeard's for a single heartbeat, and in that moment, something broke. Not in the captain, in him. Because in Blackbeard's stare, he saw no rage, only silence. And that somehow was worse. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy, a bruised ceiling stretched above the blood-wet earth. The fires crackled low around the reef, casting long, flickering shadows across the broken faces of the defeated. And at the center, bound to a tree with rusted chains and a wound still bleeding through his shirt, knelt the hawk. He was no longer the silent killer. Now he trembled. Blackbeard stood before him, unmoving, silent, yet more present than thunder. His coat was torn at the sleeve, his boots caked in ash and sand, but his eyes, they burned with something ancient, not fury, not vengeance, something colder. "Speak," he growled, his voice low, almost calm. "Or I'll have you strapped to the prow at sunrise, eyes wide open, watching the light eat you slow, one breath at a time." The hawk didn't answer at first. He tried to stay quiet, to play the same game he had mastered 100 times before, but Blackbeard stepped forward. The dagger came out, not raised, not pointed, just there in his hand, glinting with promise. "Now," the captain whispered, and the hawk broke. "It was Valera," he gasped, the words spilling like bile. "He paid me, French coin, heavy and cursed. Said it came straight from Martinique. The governor wants your head nailed to the fort gates. Said he'd erase your name from every chart, every tale." Blackbeard didn't blink. He didn't curse, didn't strike, didn't laugh. Instead, he knelt slowly. So close the assassin could smell the salt on his breath, could hear the faint jingle of beads woven into his beard. Then, with terrifying calm, Blackbeard reached out and dragged the tip of his dagger across the man's cheek, not deep, but slow, precise. A single curved mark, like a brand, a cross, etched into flesh, a symbol older than coin and colder than chains. "Wear that," he said quietly, "and every port you crawl into will know what you are." The hawk said nothing. He couldn't. The pain hadn't come from the blade, but from the silence that followed it. Blackbeard stood and turned, not granting another glance. There was no need. The mark would speak louder than words. Behind him, the crew watched in stillness. Some nodded. Others looked away. No cheer. No celebration, only understanding. Because in the world of pirates, there are only two true currencies: loyalty and the price of breaking it. They reached the island of El Roble just before dawn. Mist hung over the bay like an old secret, and the shoreline sat quiet. Too quiet for a place that housed a man who once sailed under Blackbeard's banner. Valera had buried his past behind stone walls and silk curtains, wearing fine coats and pretending to be a merchant. A respected man among French settlers, a man who smiled during Sunday prayers, poured wine for guests, and claimed the sea had never touched him. But the sea remembers. And that morning, it came for him. The Queen's Revenge crept into the harbor like a beast returning to familiar waters. Its sails were ragged but proud, its guns silent for now. When the anchor dropped, it struck the reef with a crack like thunder. Moments later, the beach exploded in fire and steel. Isabelle Leclerc led the charge. Her blade gleamed in the pale light. Her eyes locked forward, as if chasing a memory she refused to let die. The men followed her without hesitation, not because she barked orders, but because her silence promised no mercy. By the time the town stirred, the streets were already burning. Doors splintered, guns roared, and at the heart of it all, Blackbeard walked through the smoke like a shadow made flesh. He found Valera inside a mansion built on lies, a house too clean for a man with so much blood behind him. The traitor barely had time to speak before the captain shattered the door and dragged him from his chair. "You thought the sea would forget," Blackbeard said, voice low and final. "But the tide remembers every name." He hurled Valera to the floor with the weight of every oath broken. The man didn't fight. He pleaded, spoke of gold, of forgiveness, of business deals and past favors, but nothing reached the captain's ears. Blackbeard placed parchment and ink on the table. "Sign," he ordered. Valera stared, confused. "Sign what?" "Everything. Your ships, your holdings, the house, all of it, to the orphans of Nassau." There was no negotiation. Shaking defeated, Valera signed. Outside, the town burned brighter, and at the front gate of the mansion, Blackbeard ordered the crew to raise a gallows. Not for Valera, but for the man who had sold him out. The Hawk. The killer was hung at sunrise, his limp body swaying in the humid breeze, eyes forever frozen in regret. Around his neck, a wooden plaque carved by Isabelle herself. One word burned into the grain: traitor. No further justice was needed. The island watched in silence as the Queen's Revenge pulled away from shore once more, its sails cutting through the morning fog like a scar that would never heal. The sea had spoken. The sails groaned softly as the Queen's Revenge drifted back into open waters. The flames of El Roble had faded behind them, swallowed by morning mist and the quiet that comes after storms. But no one aboard celebrated. Mateo stood at the stern, hands clenched on the railing, watching the island disappear inch by inch. His eyes weren't filled with pride, only the heavy silence of someone who had seen too much too young. He had warned them. He had ridden through death to deliver that warning, and he had lived. But something inside him hadn't. What he saw in those days would never leave him. The betrayal etched on a friend's face, the scream of steel cutting through fog, the weight of judgment, falling in the shape of a rope, and a single word burned into wood: traitor. Below deck, Blackbeard hadn't spoken. He hadn't joined the crew or toasted the victory. Instead, he locked himself away in his quarters, alone with ink, maps, and memory. There, under the flickering lantern light, he wrote, "Sometimes justice doesn't come as a blade, but as memory. And at sea, no one escapes the weight of what they've done. The crew whispered. Not about the gold or the fire or the men who would never return, but about the look in their captain's eyes as he passed through the wreckage. Not anger, not triumph, just the emptiness of someone who had once believed in something and watched it rot. No treasure had been taken that day, no victory songs were sung, but something had been buried. A name, a bond, a chapter in a life too full of ghosts. As the sun rose, casting light on the deck like judgment from the sky, no one spoke. They sailed on, not toward glory, but away from the shore where justice had worn the face of silence. And Mateo? He kept watching the horizon, as if waiting for the past to rise from the sea and ask him if it had all been worth it. He never answered. Maybe he didn't know. Some say Blackbeard never truly returned after that. That a part of him stayed behind, tied to that tree, carved into the traitor's cheek, echoing through every silent page of that old diary. And the sea, well, the sea remembers. It remembers the names it took, the truths that were never spoken aloud, the justice delivered not by sword, but by the absence of forgiveness. And now, it remembers you. Did you already know this forgotten piece of history? And if you had been aboard that ship, what would you have done? What other stories of the sea deserve to be heard here? If this tale moved something in you, don't let it vanish like so many names the sea has swallowed. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep listening to what should never have been forgotten. Until then, close the diary, but never forget where you left it. The tide will bring you back.